right, good afternoon, everyone. We are going to get started with our session. As a reminder, if you're joining us via the live stream, you can chat your questions, and we'll get that here in the room. We will have a time for Q&A in here afterward, after Brandon's done. I'll walk around with the microphone. So I'd like to introduce you to Brandon Keath today, CTO of Appalachia Technology.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see all of your smiling eyes today. So we're going to talk about a really fun topic today. We're going to talk about Active Directory hacking and defenses. So to start off with, I want to start with some quick stats. So we're going to talk about what is Active Directory in a second, but let's look at some stats. Active Directory is the most widely used directory service and identity provider in the entire world. It's used by the majority of Fortune 100, 500, 1,000, you name it, companies. Most of the time, they're using Active Directory. And if that were not enough, Active Directory Azure Cloud has over 2.9 million organizations already using their service as well. Now, Active Directory hacking is often much harder to stop compared to traditional threats. You often can't stop it just by patching your systems. So who am I? My name is Brandon Keath. I am the cybersecurity officer at Appalachia Technologies. I have a master's in cybersecurity and information assurance. I have an MBA. And I have a lot of experience, over a decade, in cybersecurity with a handful of certifications. So I'm happy to share some of my insights that I've seen over the last decade in this arena. So the agenda for today, we're going to talk about what is Active Directory. What exactly is it that we're talking about? Then we're going to talk about the common problems. What are the security problems we face with Active Directory? And then we're going to talk about ADD, or Active Directory Defense. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly is Active Directory. Well, Active Directory is the piece of software that allows you to log into a Windows computer on a domain. It consists of your organization's domain. They often describe it in forests or trees. It contains all of your users, groups, trusts, so the trust between different users, files, folders, permissions, your policies, and other services. Now, this is all under Microsoft, and generally every organization is using Active Directory to a certain extent. This might be how a typical Active Directory network looks like. This is just an example. It could have databases, servers, it could be spread all over the world. Now, when we talk about Active Directory, there is a lot of valuable information contained on an Active Directory server. Active Directory servers hold all the credentials for the entire organization. That means every single person's password. That also means that just by an Active Directory server, just that one computer being hacked, it can give a cyber criminal access to any information in your entire organization. Now, I think one of the problems with how we do Active Directory is in how we deploy users and permissions. And I want to break down the technology into something that's a little bit more understandable. So I always like to use the analogy of a house. And I know what you're thinking, Brandon, there's no way you can afford a house like that in this market. And you would be right. That's like my dream house. It's beautiful. But I want to talk about, what do we think of when we think about a house or our home? I want to compare that to a computer for a second. When we think about a computer system, what does a password let us do? It gives us access into our computer, into the services. Just like the door on a home gives us access into our house, right? And then inside the house, we might have a couple additional valuables, right? We might have a safe, we might have other things that are valuable to us. Just like in a computer system, once you get in, there might be valuable documents or other things that are stored in a computer. But something that we typically don't do with with houses, that we do with computers when we set up an Active Directory network, is often computers have a lot of access to each other. So think of that as if every one of your neighbors had a key to your house. Now, I consider myself a pretty neighborly person, but probably not that neighborly, that I trust that many people with the keys to my house. But we can go a bit larger because we know that in many organizations, just one user doesn't often have access to just a handful of computers. In fact, with just a regular user account, oftentimes you have access to a couple more. There's more that you can have access to. And then there are SaaS services that take Active Directory. You have remote users using Active Directory. So the number just keeps growing, the number of the access potentially that people have. Now, I don't know if this makes sense to anyone else, but why would someone in California need access to someone's credentials in Florida, right? You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't have someone's house key from Florida in California. But with computer systems, we often do. The way we design these systems are set up in a way that they have access to each other. And that's how we need to start approaching and thinking about how we're setting up systems. Because we have powerful users and groups. Just one administrative user on a system, a domain administrator or enterprise administrator, might have access to every single computer in a domain. Imagine if one person had a key in the United States that could open every single person's house. That wouldn't be very secure, but a lot of times when we're setting up organizations, that's the way we do it. When you look at a computer, and as we'll see in a couple minutes, often when you're getting credentials from a computer, it's not just a single credential. Oftentimes you're getting multiple credentials that can be used on lots of other computers. So imagine if someone broke into your house and not only did they steal the keys to your house, but they stole a bunch of keys to get into your neighbor's house too. This is the issue we have with Active Directory. It is a downward slope, almost like a snowball. If you imagine the snowball effect, a hacker hacks into one computer, they get a handful of keys. They use those to hack into other computers. All of a sudden, the hacker is sitting on a treasure trove of access to a whole bunch of different systems. So what are some of these problems highlight with Active Directory? It's very complicated. It's hard to tell who has access to what. People come and go, accounts get disabled, but you're not really sure a lot of times what they have access to and what they don't. It's also easy to misconfigure. There's a lot of areas in Active Directory that are just configured, not necessarily bad by default, but not secure. They're configured in a way that makes sense for most organizations. There's also what I'll call many vulnerabilities by design. Someone asked me here today if what I'll be talking about are vulnerabilities that can just be patched with like a Windows update. And unfortunately, they can't. A lot of the vulnerabilities we're going to see in a couple minutes actually can only be fixed with configuration issues or running the latest and greatest software, which we'll talk about as well. So who do you trust on your network? These are some of the questions that we need to ask. When we're looking at who has access to what folders, there's lots of credentials on the network where just a single domain user, just a regular normal account, can read almost every single account for the entire organization. Think about that. With one user account, you can find out who all the people are that work at a company. That sounds pretty dangerous, but it also sounds like the white pages too. But unlike the white pages that takes a very long time to go through, I've tried, if you can find one anymore, it's a lot easier for cyber criminals with one credential to start figuring out what people do in an organization. So let's talk a little bit, and I'm not going to get too into the weeds here. Let's talk about Kerberos and how Windows does authentication. So Windows Kerberos is more or less the standard or default communication. You request a ticket, there's a ticket plus a session key, there's a request ticket and authorization, and then it finally gives you a ticket and a session. And Kerberos is fairly secure, but there's a couple things that Kerberos lets you do that can be taken advantage of. And one of those things is you as a user, depending on your permissions, can request a ticket to run a service as another user. Well, maybe you need to run a service, maybe you have a specific application in your organization that needs to be run as another user. Maybe you need to run this, but you don't have permissions, but you can use Kerberos to do that. Well, what can a hacker do with that? They can pretend or masquerade around as a different user. All right, so let's get into, so that's some background, a little bit of theory. Let's get into how the bad guys actually do it. How do they take advantage of Active Directory? Well, the first way they do it is what I call man-in-the-middle attacks, or sometimes called OnPath attacks. This is where you listen for different network requests. This is often done via something called NetBIOS or LLMNR. I don't want you to get caught up on that terminology too much, because that terminology doesn't matter as much as just the idea that you're just listening on the network for traffic. And you're going to see that as a reoccurring theme. You're listening for traffic, and then you're going to intercept that traffic to steal credentials. And once you have those credentials, you're going to use them to log into other services. So how might this work on a computer system? Say we have server A here. Server A is trying to send a file to server B. What happens in networking is server A will send out a request saying, does anyone know where server B is? I need to send a file to server B. Server B will say, I'm server B, you can send that file to me, and the communication then happens. But what can the hacker do? The hacker can say, ignore him, I'm server B. Now you would think at this point that the server A might say, no, you're not. I'm not going to send my credentials to you. But an interesting thing happens here. What actually happens is server A says, okay, here's my credentials. And then the hacker is then able to take those same credentials and go to server B and say, hey, I'm server A, and here's my credentials. So now we've intercepted that communication, and we're logging in as another person. Now that may sound theoretical, but I'm going to show you right now how that happens. This is a hacking tool called Responder, often used for these kind of attacks. You can see a whole bunch of areas and protocols that it's listening on, but here's the key part. We're going to send out a request. We're going to use PowerShell, but we could send out this request. We're looking for test/share. We're asking the network, does anyone know where test/share is? And we're getting a response. It says, please enter your username and password. Now the user, now this could happen in a GUI too, is going to respond. And as we can see, right there is our user and hashed password. It was that easy. So when hackers get into a system, this is one of the most common ways, and I would argue to say probably the most common way credentials are stolen. It's not stolen with the latest exploit. It's taking advantage of the way computers talk to one another to steal credentials. We talk about social engineering and phishing. Well, here is another case where we're doing a little bit of social engineering, but maybe it's not really against the people, but against the way the protocols work. So that's one way you can steal credentials. But here's another way. There's another way we can do this called Kerberos Roasting. Now remember I talked about we can abuse the Kerberos ticket granting system. Now the way we can do that is we can again listen to network traffic and hope to catch credentials, or we can generate the traffic ourselves as long as we have one user on the network. Remember, all we need is one credential. And if we use Responder, we might already have those credentials. So let's look at how we might do Kerberos Roasting. So we are going to log into a computer, an Active Directory controller, using credentials that we gained. And what Kerberos Roasting will do is going to give us, and you can see it right there, all the usernames and hashed passwords for all of the service accounts on the network. And you heard me right, all of the service accounts on the network. Now, what do you typically have running with service accounts? Typically, that's not the low-level user. That is a high-level user that has a lot of access, and sometimes it's running as a domain administrator or the highest level administrator. Now, I'm showing another example here of how once I have access to at least a high enough level user, I can start to dump all of the credentials on Active Directory. So this was all done with, this is called CrapMap Exec. It's a very popular hacking tool. It's open source. Anyone can go out and download this tool. And I was able to do that with just one credential. So there's a couple other attacks that you can do. There's an attack called a DC sync attack. So this is where we get an account that has domain replication privileges. So what we can do is set up a fake domain controller and then trick Active Directory into giving us all of the credentials. So we can use a tool called Mimikatz, another very common hacking tool used in a lot of APTs, and by legitimate defenders as well, but used to retrieve passwords running a fake DC. That's another way we can do it. And if that weren't enough, we can also use IPv6. Now you're going to see a trend here in order to use IPv6, and if you have IPv6 on your network at all, I recommend to disable it unless there's a reason you need it right now. Generally, most people I talk to are not using IPv6. But by default, if you're running Windows, you likely have an IPv6 address. And there are tools. You set up a fake IPv6 DHCP server, and you wait for connections. By default, when you boot up your Windows 10 machine, it will send out an alert. It will send out a network request saying, is there an IPv6 DHCP server I should connect to? Now, generally, this doesn't matter because most people aren't running IPv6, so no one's going to answer. But if we're the hacker, we can answer. And again, they give us their credentials, we go to Active Directory with those credentials, and now we create a brand new user. Notice that, again, none of these attacks are what you typically think of when you think of how bad guys are getting into systems. They talk about exploiting a vulnerability, but these aren't vulnerabilities that you patch. We're just taking advantage of the way Active Directory is built. It's built to authenticate and connect users, and we're twisting that to gain access. So once we have at least one domain user, any user, what do we do with that information? How would we get further into a network? And maybe we don't have a domain admin. Maybe we just have a regular user. And maybe we got those credentials from phishing or some other way. Or maybe a data breach gave those credentials. What can we do with that? Well, we can start to do some enumeration using a tool called Bloodhound. Now, Bloodhound is kind of like GPS for Active Directory. It can map out different attack patterns, and it can actually tell you where different user accounts are logged in. Now you might say, why does that matter? What does it matter if different people are logged into different machines? Well, when you log into a computer, your credentials sit in that computer in memory, in the RAM of that computer. So if the computer doesn't restart, your credentials are sitting there waiting to be stolen. And this tool will tell hackers exactly where those credentials are. So here's an example. Again, we have our administrator user, and we are going to grab a bunch of information from this domain controller. We're running a Python script that's going to send a bunch of LDAP requests to this domain. So it's going to find a domain, and it's going to use the rights of that user to download a list of all the users, all the groups, all the trusts in that domain so that we can see everything. So if you look here, it puts it all in JSON files for us. So now even with a regular user account, we know what users exist in that network, what domains exist, everything. And generally, your SIMs aren't going to pick up on this. You might see the spike in network traffic, but it's going to just look like Active Directory requests, because that's how Active Directory works. It's a directory service. It's meant to be read. But what we can do with this data is we can then map it. So we import this data into Bloodhound, and then we can start to pull out lots of information. In our example, these are all the domain admins in the account. We can look at all the information, such as when the last password was changed, and where their credentials might exist in the network. We can look at what Kerberos roastable users exist. So we can actually get a list and see if there's any users in existence that we can grab. We can also look at the shortest attack paths. We can look at which users have DC sync access, and we can figure out what our shortest path is from our current users that we've compromised to a domain admin account. Now, why is this important? It's important because the advanced persistent threats and the malware that exists are already using these tools. They've already integrated them into their tool sets, and they're using them to hack companies all over the world. And a patch isn't going to fix it. So how do we start to defend this stuff? Remember, I said Active Directory defenses. And I think ADD is a really good acronym because we get so distracted with everything else that this becomes a very hard area to remediate. So how do we handle Kerberos roasting? Microsoft recommends limiting the number of service accounts and all service accounts having at least 25 plus character passwords. Why is Microsoft recommending that? Well, when you get those service accounts, you still have to crack the hashing algorithm. The idea is if it's under 25 characters, it's going to take them too long to crack the password. Now, that might work in general, but most organizations I've talked to, a lot of service accounts are not 25 plus character passwords. And what's worse, often when a service account is set up, it's set up with a password, and then it's often not changed. That makes this a difficult area to look at. So how do we start to limit that? Well, we have to look at what are our service accounts running, and can we limit the number that are running? Can we have lower privilege users running the same types of things? That can be difficult to do. Not impossible, but the idea is you can't just outright stop it. There's not going to be a patch, you can't turn it off. That's the way Active Directory works. So how do we remove DC sync? Well, we have to remove all users with DC sync rights. Well, what if we need users with DC sync rights? Then we have to look at where those users are and make sure that those credentials can't be taken, or at least track whenever that user is used on the network. How do we stop IPv6? Now, I gave this one away already, but the key is turning off IPv6. Now, if you need IPv6, and some organizations do, and some SIMs require IPv6 and use IPv6, then you need to run your own IPv6 DHCP server. So that way, if a request comes out, you're responding to the user instead of the bad guys. Now, some of this can be picked up via some SIM or SOC tuning, but it can be pretty difficult. You'll notice spikes in traffic far before you realize, in many cases, what a bad guy is doing. Now, that doesn't mean there's no hope, because in the latest Windows Server and in the latest Windows 11, some of the new features that came out, and Windows 11 came out 2 days ago, I downloaded it, I was one of the first ones to suffer through the upgrade. There are additional defenses to stop some of these kinds of attacks. So by upgrading to some of the latest software, you can mitigate some of this stuff. But a lot of us still have legacy software. That's not going to be something that we can do immediately. So another thing we can do is limit and track privileged accounts. One tool we can use to do that is we can use Bloodhound, just like the bad guys do. Now, Bloodhound is an open source tool, but there is also an enterprise version. So you can look into that if that's something your organization wants to look at. You can use the open source tool, figure out where your users are, and start to lock down those accounts. So some final thoughts before we get into questions. There's a lot of flaws that exist in Active Directory, just the way it was built. And that's okay. It was built decades ago, and it's been built on. There's a lot of issues in the way we used to do things, computing-wise, and those things are adding up. The solution isn't necessarily getting rid of Active Directory, but making sure we're running the latest version. If you are running an Active Directory server that's at least 2008, for example, every Active Directory server you run will be forced to run at that level with that level's security features. So ensuring that you're running the most up-to-date with all the remediations is important. Now, the second thing to think about is none of this is theoretical. Cyber criminals are actively exploiting these flaws. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can look at MITRE. Their researchers have shown that their malware is already using either tools like I've shown or those exact same tools, because they're open source, to hack into systems. And third, remediating these issues should be a top priority. Why? Because hackers are going to these because they tend to work. A lot of these attacks work by default. That means that it doesn't matter if someone is at a certain patch level or not. The other reason these work is because, unlike a lot of malware and exploits that your antivirus will pick up on, these kind of attacks often slip under the radar. After all, if Kevin from accounting is logged in at 2 a.m., how do you know it's really Kevin? Or how do you know it's not someone that's stolen Kevin's credentials?